But the reality is, when many of the refugees leave their countries and they hop on these vehicles or in very dangerous circumstances, they have no idea what their destination is. They're not told where they're going. They're just told, you have a chance, and tonight is the time to go. Let's go. And they go, right? And so I think that there's this somehow this negative narrative and the criminalization that's attributed to these communities. The gamification of the system has sapped people's ability to be able to empathize with the realities that those communities are fleeing from.
Welcome to Proudly Asian, a podcast series that tells bold and proud stories of Asians by Asians. I'm Isabel Wong, a financial journalist who wants to uncover the many Asian stories around us that are waiting to be told. There's never just one way to look at Asians. This podcast will take you through a deep dive into the life stories, struggles, and triumphs of young Asians around the world. On today's episode, we have Puja Kapai, a multi-awards-winning researcher, academic, and community justice advocate. Born and raised in Hong Kong, Puja is also an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. She talks to us about her work in minority rights, capturing unconscious bias in data, and why discrimination against ethnic minorities exists in Asia. Welcome back to Proudly Asian. On our podcast, we always talk about the representation of Asian diasporas in different parts of the world and why a certain group is underrepresented. And one of the reasons I think a lot of us would agree is that Asian communities outside Asia can be quite spread out, and that sort of explains why they are so underrepresented most of the time, and because they also come from diverse cultures, so it's even harder to capture all of their experiences in data. And if the presence of Asian diasporas is so hard to capture in data, it makes unconscious bias and racism in any parts of the world even harder to show up on data. So this is why I'm bringing in our guest this week, because part of her work is basically putting racism and unconscious bias, especially with ethnic minorities in Asia, on the map. So thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Proudly Asian, Puja. How are you?
Hi, Isabel. I'm doing really well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I really look forward to hearing your insights and just basically hearing about the work that you've been doing in terms of human rights with ethnic minorities and also the kind of research work that you've been doing. But before we get into that part, why don't we start with a quick introduction about yourself? So, Puja, we always ask our guests this set of questions. Who are you? What are you, and where did you grow up?
So I'm Puja Kapai, and I'm an associate professor of law at the University of Hong Kong. I'm also our convener of the Women's Studies Research Center, where we look at issues ranging across the board in relation to gender equality, racial diversity, inclusion, belonging, and social justice. I come to this work with a firm sort of legal background. I was in one lifetime a practicing lawyer before I moved to academia. And I grew up right here in Hong Kong and went through the school system here. I've had a few stints overseas where I pursued a year on exchange in the UK, and I did my master's in the US. So I do have that experience of living elsewhere as a minority, but Hong Kong is very much sort of my home.
Amazing. So, just out of curiosity, has your experience growing up in Hong Kong inspired you to go into your current line of work, or what are the reasons why you're doing what you're doing?
I'd say in every way, I think the experiences I've had growing up in Hong Kong and the opportunities I've had access to, but also the doors that were closed to me, have very much prompted the line of work that I'm passionate about. Is specifically not only in terms of my experiences as a woman, but more importantly, my experiences as an ethnic minority woman. And I'd say growing up as an ethnic minority child in Hong Kong, undergoing sort of the local school system, and really trying to understand what my sort of dreams are and what I'm destined for. All of that, I would have to say, it has been shaped by the series of experiences I've had. And most often it's been shaped by kind of doors closing, denials of opportunities, or sort of people passing over me. But, that's really what has opened up a whole new world and a different perspective for me, which made it very clear why, this line of work is so important to sort of draw attention to the issues that people continue to confront, even well long after I've gone through the system, and how they remain really sort of pertinent, today, not just in Hong Kong, but really for diasporas everywhere.
hmm One of the main topics that I want to talk to you about and ask for your insights is definitely the current state of play in terms of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong. And I know that you've been dedicated, like you mentioned, most of your career in human rights for ethnic minorities. So could you begin by unpacking the current state of play for the ethnic minorities groups in Asia and Hong Kong? How are we doing in terms of equality, and has the overall situation improved over the years in your view?
So I'd say that, one of the things that caught my attention was to examine the status of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, because for years I had the sense that for some reason members of our communities were not doing very well. And we seem to be grossly underrepresented in a range of professions, or sort of we're not very sort of visible in public for the right reasons. In fact, I would see us being visible in the public eye for the wrong reasons. And it really sort of prompted sort of this investigation into why it is that this is the case. Because around me, I could identify people who were really bright, intelligent, who had the passion to contribute, but yet they weren't necessarily making their way up the sort of the ladder. And so that led me to look really deeply at the existing research and statistics that we had on hand in relation to ethnic minorities in Hong Kong specifically. And so I drew together all of this research between 1997, which was when there was the return of sovereignty to China in terms of Hong Kong. And I looked at that sort of data between 1997 and 2014. So really looking at it over a lengthy sort of almost 15 to 17 years of a period, and to examine sort of what was the pattern like. And what really sort of struck me was how across every sphere that I examined, whether it was experiences of day-to-day discrimination, to experiences in the education system, hiring and firing processes, poverty, home ownership, healthcare, and crime and law enforcement. So across all of these spheres of life, ethnic minorities were persistently underrepresented or underperforming or overrepresented if we're talking about poverty and sort of crime and law enforcement. And that struck me as extremely worrying, and really sort of prompted a deeper level inquiry into why. And obviously, for me, as a legal scholar, it really came down to understanding the patterns of discrimination and systemic inequality that had somehow been built into the systems that have been designed to improve people's lives and their opportunities. And I could start to recognize some of the patterns at play, which basically shaped our lifelong trajectory from the moment we try to access schools. And I noticed that it was basically a pathway that we were destined to follow, because the system kind of encased us along this particular pathway. And to break free of that was extremely difficult. And you had to have a great deal of fortuity or intelligence and network, or you had to have a generational kind of intergenerational sort of wealth or support system to really kind of catapult you out of this systemic kind of encasement in a life of deprivation. And I'd say that, beyond kind of looking at this in the Hong Kong context, what became very clear over the past few years is that this is the systemic pattern that is in play for minorities around the world by and large. And this applies to the diasporic communities. And what's even more, I think, revealing is as I applied an intersectional lens, not just necessarily looking at race, but digging even deeper to look at factors such as race, religion, gender, and trying to see how these different permutations work together to identify whether ethnic minority women or Muslim women, for example, Muslim men, how were they faring in these, different contexts in relation to education or healthcare and poverty. It became very clear that these patterns were manifesting globally, and it's really come, I think, forward in an unexpected way in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement. But it's really sort of unraveled the historically entrenched position of minority communities that is kind of a hangover or a legacy of kind of the historic slavery or colonialism that many diasporic communities have lived under, right? And of course, for the African American populations and African communities generally around the world, I think they've experienced kind of a very different type of imperialism, which is pervasive, not just in terms of opportunities, but also the legacy of that narrative that has carried over and sort of been very deeply entrenched across the board. And so the question, after sort of compiling these statistics and really demonstrating through evidence to say this is a problem that we need to contend with, because typically, governments don't like to confront the notion that they are somehow, discriminating against particular groups, because that's not considered to be civilized. And obviously that's a violation of our human rights obligations under international law. But having the data set really helps put these issues on the map and has helped to kind of set the agenda in terms of what are we going to do now to tackle this now that we recognize this as a problem. So for me, that was really, really important to do, because up until then, over 20 years of advocacy, the response has typically been, we don't have a race discrimination problem in Hong Kong, at least, because we're so multicultural, we're such an international city, and, things like that. So I'd say that there's a nexus between kind of the domestic patterns that I've managed to uncover and what we're seeing emerging globally.
Right. I would like to specifically follow up on the example that you mentioned about the education options or pathway for ethnic minorities in Hong Kong. Like, can you elaborate a little bit more? Is it around whether or not they might be able to afford, let's say, international schooling, or if they go through traditional schooling path, they would be expected to do the same Chinese language exam? Like, could you be a little bit more specific about that?
Sure. So, we have a public education system which anybody is eligible to enter into as long as you have a Hong Kong sort of identity card. And this is sort of from the primary level onwards. For kindergarten, that's still largely managed by sort of government subvented NGOs, or it's sort of privately managed. And, so one of the trends is that because these kindergartens are managed privately or by NGOs, you've got a huge range in terms of resources, but also sort of capacity to be able to educate children who do not have Chinese as kind of their home language. And so many ethnic minority children end up in sort of, if they can afford it, they would end up in the private kind of kindergartens, which generally don't have a focus on Chinese. They tend to be in English predominantly, or there are some that do sort of have programs in Chinese, but the focus is typically Putonghua. But they're very expensive. And as you rightly noted, that would typically put out of pocket many of the communities that we're talking about. And in that sort of scenario, most of them would want to turn to kind of the local system. And that basically means NGOs that are receiving some grants from the government to run their programs. And the government has in recent years, as a result of the advocacy that I've done together with other NGOs, allocated more funds for NGOs or sort of kindergartens that receive more non-Chinese children and enroll them. And the idea is for them to sort of expend these resources on integrating these children, providing better education opportunities so that they can actually grasp the language. But the reality is that the interviews still continue to be conducted in Cantonese. And you might not even be shortlisted for the interview if your application doesn't demonstrate some of the eligibility markers. So sometimes there's priority given for siblings, or if you've got a parent who is alumnus and things like that. So there are many factors which often put ethnic minority children sort of out of competition in terms of being able to access the opportunities. I mean, you can imagine admission interviews for typically 2-year-olds who are going to preschool, and they're required to demonstrate their language skills in Cantonese, but they wouldn't have any because there's nobody at home who speaks Cantonese. So I've gone through that with my older boy who's now 9, and we did these interviews, and it's only that because he was sort of placed in these play groups where he had some exposure to Cantonese, that he knew a few words. But again, I really don't think that any other sort of parents who might not have had the luxury of sending their kids to these playgroups would have been able to, keep up with these processes, let alone sort of ensure their child has the necessary linguistic exposure. And they probably wouldn't have fared well through the interviews anyway. So that process, basically, in terms of whether you are placed in an institution where your child is exposed to Chinese or not, pretty much dictates which primary school you get into in the public system. And typically, if you are not able to kind of acquire the Chinese language skills, you'll yet again not be shortlisted in the kind of primary school interviews for the schools that you're keen on. And you'll probably be chaperoned towards the English medium of instruction schools for your child, which, again, have come to be characterized by a predominantly ethnic minority population, right? So there are these segregated schools, even though that is no longer the official policy of the Hong Kong government. But there was a policy between 2004 and 2014 where these schools were sort of designated as the schools that would predominantly receive ethnic minority children on the basis that, they would be taught Chinese at a pace that would be relevant to their ability to grasp the language. But, the data and the evidence shows that these children were in effect being shortchanged because they were not exposed to a Chinese language speaking environment in which they could effectively practice the language. And the curriculum was very basic to the point where even Form 6 graduates were only speaking Chinese to the level of a primary 2 or a primary 3 student in their sort of equivalent in the local system, right? And obviously you can imagine if you're graduating from Form 6 and that's your level of Chinese, you're probably not going to be competitive in the job market at all, right? And not only just that, but also that would undermine your prospects of entering Hong Kong universities. So that's sort of the trajectory that you're set up for if you belong to sort of a family where Chinese is not sort of your mother tongue language or not your home language. And the school system, although, this segregated schooling system was disbanded in 2014, invariably minority parents still continue to send their children to these schools because there's familiarity. There's a community, there's a sense of belonging, and the parents feel that throwing their kids into the mainstream system is like throwing them into the deep end, and their kids are probably unlikely to be able to survive those schools. And again, I'll say this, having a child myself who's going through the public school system now, who's in grade 3, and he's in the Chinese stream. And, with all the support that we can provide him, it is still so, so difficult. It's such a battle every day to persuade him to kind of keep at Chinese and to tell him that his grades are not reflective of his abilities, and to encourage him and to say that this is really important because it will help you down the line to kind of belong and to be integrated. So I think that there's a lot really that needs to be done in order to make it possible for more non-Chinese children to be placed in these contexts where they have a genuine opportunity to acquire Chinese to a level that is equivalent to their peers. And that sometimes means that you have to put in more resources in order to equip them to be able to do better progressively. And that's not being done. I think that there's this real sense of a conflict within the education system because there are many gaps and they apply to the overall population, children who have special education needs, or children in Hong Kong who need more support in learning better English, for example, or, STEM subjects need to be emphasized. So I think there's a real challenge in terms of how to balance those resources. And then you've got this group, which is really the underclass, that's also demanding additional resources. But it's so vital because, as I've said, and there are many studies to sort of undergird this reality, this lack of opportunity to achieve Chinese to the requisite level really dictates the long-term future pathway of these children. And it can make the difference between them sort of being trapped in a cycle of intergenerational poverty, or being able to break free and becoming the first in the family to enter university and become a professional.
It really sounds like one missed opportunity could have implications for decades or even generations. And a lot of times it's not even something that they could control. Like a lot of it could come from socioeconomic factors, and also in the sense of like, even if you can somehow fight enough to access the same set of resources, there will always be Chinese Hong Kong classmates around you who might have even more additional resources. So I hear a lot of these happening around the schooling system in the city. But the next part I want to ask you about is when it comes to ethnic minorities communities in Hong Kong, there's one group that is often not very visible or represented, which for our international listeners, they might not even have had the chance to hear about their current situation, which will be the refugees in Hong Kong. So, just for awareness, could you tell us a little bit more about what it means to be refugees in Hong Kong and what's the size of the population?
Sure. So I think it might sort of help if I put it into context of the broader ethnic minority community, right? So Hong Kong's ethnic minorities generally comprise 8% of the total population. Out of that 8%, 4%, 4.2% to be exact, comprise the domestic worker population groups, right? So these are the migrant domestic workers who come to Hong Kong to work in households in order that Hong Kong women and men can go to work, right? So they really help to support the families with childcare or elderly care. So the remainder of the sort of homegrown ethnic minority population is around 3.8%. And that has a spread of a range of different ethnic groups, including um, uh, Indians, Nepalese, Pakistanis, Japanese, Koreans, Indonesians, Filipino, Vietnamese people. So that's sort of the broad sort of groupings. And the South Asian community is one of the larger sort of ethnic groups among sort of that population group. Then, when we talk about ethnic minorities in Hong Kong and in terms of policy, it's sort of a misnomer, but generally it's understood that we're not referring to the refugee community, and we're not referring to the domestic worker population. So a lot of the conversations we're having about exclusion or racism, somehow they do not reference the experiences of the refugees and migrant domestic workers. Whereas obviously, because of their immigration status or lack thereof, they're probably the groups that are also very significantly impacted by racism, right? That they experience in the course of their own precarity and vulnerability, right? So this particular group of refugees in Hong Kong, in terms of size, I would say they range from between about 10 to 14,000, going by the latest statistics. And the part of the challenge has been the fact that this is a group that has remained static and in wait for a long time in Hong Kong, because we've had a very strict sort of screening system in Hong Kong, which has meant that those who come here and file for a declaration of being sort of a refugee have to wait for a decade or almost 2 decades before their applications are screened successfully or not. And we've had several sort of judicial challenges in relation to the mechanisms for screening. And I won't go into sort of great depth around sort of these mechanisms, but long and short of it is that it is so difficult to get this declaration of refugee status through the Hong Kong system because of stereotypes such as most of our refugee claimants are economic migrants who are just trying to come to Hong Kong to game the system in order to, seek jobs illegally and to stay on in the territory. This claim has also been made about migrant domestic workers who come here as migrant workers and then end up overstaying their visa. And then they end up filing for a refugee claim because they say that they will be persecuted in their home countries. Some of them say this on the basis that they might have engaged in a same sex relationship, for example, in Hong Kong, and that could be a cause for persecution when they go back home, say in Indonesia, where this would be considered to be haram because they're, of a Muslim background. And others might have had children out of wedlock while they're in Hong Kong. And again, that would be another cause for gender based persecution and things like that. And so the narrative around refugees in Hong Kong is extremely negative, and that negativity has been fueled largely by the media. And so I did this wide scale study together with two students of mine in 2016 and 2017, where we examined the media discourse around refugee claimants. And what we found after examining about nearly 3,000 articles in the English and Chinese media was that consistently across the board in general, especially in the Chinese media, you would often find the term refugee to be very closely located with words that suggested criminality, illegality, or drugs or deviance, right? And so that kind of messaging was very pervasive. And we found that the time when this kind of rhetoric was most escalated was around the time of elections for the Legislative Council. So it's very politicized, very similar to what we see happening in the United Kingdom, for example, where there is this huge debate ongoing around what to do with people coming over by boat and whether to send them back. And again, of course, this has been also a prominent feature of election campaigns in the US, especially when Donald Trump was coming to power, and so that entire kind of zooming in onto immigrants as sort of the scapegoat of all of the problems that a community is experiencing is very strategic. And again, it's a global strategy that has been deployed by politicians for beyond a century. So even in the 1800s, we know that the U.S. had, the act that prohibited Chinese from entering the United States. And cut to today, we still have legislation that is trying to keep certain people out. And so the media really sort of uses this rhetoric to create this impression that we have a burgeoning group of refugees that are continuing to come to Hong Kong and they're overwhelming our resources, and that most of those claims are not legitimate and they don't deserve our sympathy because they tend to be criminals or they're fake refugees. That's been the narrative in Hong Kong. The other thing that we've noticed also is that they seem to overplay the representation of particular groups. So, for example, the news outlets would report that there is a substantial group of Indian and Pakistani refugees. Whereas in reality, if you compare those statistics with what is at the immigration department, right, what's available in that data set, it's significantly less. So in the study, we found that the media claimed there were 31% of refugees were of Indian background and 18% were Pakistani. Whereas in the immigration data set, there were 21% of Indians and 20% of the Pakistani community. Likewise, Vietnamese refugees are overplayed as representing sort of 28%, whereas in actuality, they were just 14% of the entire group. So this kind of playing around with sort of racial or national backgrounds also creates the stereotype between Indian and Pakistani or Vietnamese, again, being associated with criminality, drug peddling, and those kind of very negative stereotypes. And of course, whatever the rhetoric or stereotypes that exist about refugees then rubs off onto what people think about ethnic minority groups who are permanent residents of Hong Kong, right? especially the South Asian population group. And so you start to see in that period an increasing sentiment among the local ethnic minority communities of being treated as though they're outsiders and that they don't belong, or experiencing kind of negative or racist sort of treatment. And of course, the greatest tragedy is that some of the role models, right, the people who have power, are the ones who are partaking in this negative rhetoric because of election or other sort of strategic reasons, right? To kind of reflect to the Chinese community that they're aware of the problem and this is the problem that we have to tackle. And as you also know, it's very common to problematize vulnerable groups because it's convenient and you can help deflect sort of attention from the real issues that you really don't want to be under the spotlight. So that's definitely been true and characteristic of how Hong Kong refugee communities have been treated. And a final statistic I'll leave you with is, despite these thousands of claims in the past few years, even though there have been some reforms related to the mechanism, there's been a less than 1% success rate of refugees being able to successfully claim that they're entitled to this declaration. And why do I talk about a declaration? It's because Hong Kong is too small for refugees to actually relocate here. So when people come here and then they seek this declaration, after they get the declaration, they then have to wait to be relocated to a third country, which is sort of willing to take refugees in. So, for example, Canada or Australia or wherever else, right? So Hong Kong is not a community that can house refugees permanently. We're sort of a transit point where we help to resettle people. So in that sense, we don't have a long-term stake in sort of establishing the refugee status of communities. And so it's very difficult to understand why we would put so many people on hold or reject them. Of course, now I understand why we reject them. We reject their claims because then we can deport them. And in fact, now a new policy has come into play through law that once a decision is made, you can immediately deport the refugee and you don't have to allow them to stay in the territory, even if they're appealing that particular decision. And of course, we know that once they're out of the city, any appeal is probably unlikely to have any sort of significant impact. So that's where we're at. And I think that we have to understand these links between the negative perceptions and the feelings of fear that are really designed to make us feel like we're under attack by this community of people or we're being overwhelmed. So you'll notice the language in the media, the rhetoric, which is common in the US and Hong Kong and the UK, where, a swarm of refugees or a boatload of people, they're flooding or overwhelming our resources. So these words, this narrative, again, is deployed precisely to prime us, really, to color our thinking and to feel overwhelmed by these communities so that when people mention the term refugees or talk about South Asian groups, we instantly connect them with people who draw on resources, who will mean more for them mean less for us. And they're flooding our schools. And so if we give in to them, then our children would probably have less resources for them. So our policy should be to basically, hardline and say no, right?
Yeah, that's right. And like you mentioned earlier, right? A lot of refugees, they would always have to end up waiting for like 10 years, decades before the application even get reviewed, either successful or unsuccessful. And this period of time, basically, it leaves them no choice because they are not allowed to take jobs. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it leaves them no choice but to make a living. They might have to engage in illegal activities and business. So which sort of further fuels that label of like them being criminals or drug traffickers, right?
Yes. So, the stipend that they receive, in fact, it's not even a stipend, they receive in-kind kind of supplies to sustain themselves. And it's such a menial amount and it's sort of coupons. So they have to spend those coupons at particular places, even though they could get the same goods more cheaply or in quantities that are more manageable for them from other vendors. They can't do that. So it's a very constrained kind of economic situation that they have. And, there's no provision made for different kinds of families. So, for example, if you have a child, you might not need as many bags of rice, but you need formula, for example, or you need diapers. And so all of that, you wouldn't want to necessarily get from Welcome or Park and Shop, which are more of the high-end supermarkets. You want to get it from a pharmacy where you can get it for much cheaper, for example. And so these flexibilities are taken away because it's, the mentality is you have to scrutinize and account for every dollar that they're spending, and want to make sure that they're only spending it on money and on food and transport and basic living expenses.
Mhm.
A lot of the housing situation is also, you know, deeply sort of problematic. There's a lot of hygiene issues and health issues in terms of the conditions that they're living in. And as you said, if you're here for 10 to 14 years, imagine you're this qualified lawyer or engineer, and you're sitting here and you're not allowed to work, and you have a family. And, what do? It's psychologically a drain, right? You're living in this fear of persecution, this complete uncertainty, and basically your life is passing you by, and you're still, you're stuck and trapped in a system. Whereas the narrative very much is that these people calculate and come to Hong Kong on the pretext of their sort of, uh, politicized situation or persecution, and they want to game the system. But the reality is, when many of the refugees leave their countries and they hop on these vehicles or in very dangerous circumstances, they have no idea what their destination is. They're not told where they're going. They're just told, you have a chance, and tonight is the time to go. Let's go. And they go, right? And so I think that there's this somehow this negative narrative and the criminalization that's attributed to these communities. The gamification of the system has sapped people's ability to be able to empathize with the realities that those communities are fleeing from.
Mhm.
And it's kind of increased the apathy. So somehow we have been primed by the media to not feel sort of the sense of persecution that these communities are running away from. And even when they tell their stories, we're we're primed not to feel um, anything, any sense of responsibility. And I think that's the critical danger of kind of these biases that are creeping into our minds against certain groups, right? They're not coming out of nowhere. These biases are very much designed, and they're calculated, and they're widespread.
And in this sense, all the issues that are facing ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, all of them basically go beyond racism. It's really a mixed set of issues, including socioeconomic, gender, and all that's at play, right? So, can the society even go about solving these issues? Or, like you mentioned, since people don't really feel bad, is there even a reason or motivation for local policymakers to solve these issues?
Absolutely, right? So one of the things that the research I did on the status of ethnic minorities revealed was that, Hong Kong's population growth has slowed tragically. And one of the fastest growing communities, however, is our ethnic minority youth. So these young people are essentially going to be the future productive members of Hong Kong society. So there is every incentive with our aging population, there's every incentive to make sure that they're on the right path to become productive individuals, as opposed to individuals who end up relying on, social security. And I would say that it's a huge oversight not to have this futuristic mindset, to be able to anticipate the huge talent pool that we're basically sacrificing at the altar of prejudice and exclusion. And it's predicated on this misconception that Hong Kong's ethnic minorities are a transient population group. They're not here to stay. They came in and they're going to leave. But we didn't come in from anywhere. We've been here, right? So many of us have been here for 4 or 5 generations since the British first landed in Hong Kong, right? Right in the 1840s, some of the first population groups were the Indians. Who came here with the British Battalion. Some of the first landmark institutions that are globally recognized today were established by prominent ethnic minority businessmen. For example, the University of Hong Kong, the foundation stone was laid by a Parsi member. The Hong Kong Star Ferry was set up by Hormish G. Modi, who's also a Parsi gentleman businessman, the HSBC, right? So all of these landmarks. So these are widely recognized global landmarks. And yet the discourse on ethnic minorities seems to be out of place in terms of treating us as though we're population groups that are here for a short time and have no invested future in Hong Kong. So I think that really, that mindset must change. And we need to recognize the huge incentive that is there for the Hong Kong government, but also the people to look to this potential talent pool that's a huge resource for the future and the success of Hong Kong. It's going to define kind of the economic success of, the coming decades.
And I also know that some of the recent work that you've been doing, you're really trying to put areas that are hard to show up on data, for example, unconscious bias and stigma. Like you're really trying to capture them in data, right? I want to understand more about the work that you're doing there. What kind of approach are you taking to monitor and document unconscious bias and stigma in a way that's in data sets, basically?
So the Status of Ethnic Minorities report was an attempt to capture, the actual biases, right? The systemic biases, which are kind of demonstrated by the statistics themselves, right? And some people may argue that just because you have, data set A that then demonstrate that some people are not as well off as others doesn't necessarily depict a causal link between, their condition and Hong Kong government policies. However, I think that there's enough of a body of research to demonstrate that there is a very important nexus, and education has a huge role to play. And the lack of educational sort of equity has a huge role to play in determining these circumstances. However, moving beyond that, one of the challenges of data is that sometimes it has the tendency to obfuscate what is really at play, and it can't really quite capture the kind of nuanced environmental factors that are also playing into the process of invisibilizing certain communities or marginalizing certain communities. And so the work that I'm doing on unconscious bias is really designed to, first of all, displace this idea that that there is no unconscious bias in the context of Asia, because a lot of the studies related to unconscious bias hail from the West, right? Those are the typical reference points that we have, that especially in the US, there's a huge plethora of studies. And they pertain to different population groups, such as the Asian American community, the African American community, sexual minorities, religious minorities. So they the whole gamut. And what I wanted to do with this, really small piece of work was to say that, now we have data that we have unconscious bias in Hong Kong and also in Asia, right? That's sort of a way of grounding the conversation to say, first of all, it's not a Western problem, it's a global problem. But also to highlight that, although bias is global in nature, the way in which these biases manifest and affect sort of our communities are different, right? So the way in which Asian Americans or South Asians, for example, are treated in America doesn't necessarily denote how they would be treated in Hong Kong. And I wanted to capture that through this sort of piece of research. And then, more importantly, apart from using this research as a tool to raise awareness, I wanted to focus on what are the most significant areas where biases are having a huge impact. And so the study I did looked at the manifestation of bias in relation to gender in general. So gender and career, sort of, how successful can women be, for example, and whether they should be leaders or not, but also gender and sciences. So our predispositions to thinking about women as not being particularly strong at sciences or STEM, and, the kind of male dominance that we have in our society. I wanted to examine that, explore that a little bit more, because I think the Hong Kong population really does care about equality in relation to gender, and yet recognizes that there are these cultural stereotypes that do hold women back. And then the other facet of the study was really to explore where we sit on the spectrum of racial bias. And I focused on two types of racial biases. One is Chinese people's attitudes towards South Asians in Hong Kong. And then I also was interested in exploring the racial biases of Hong Kong Chinese towards mainland Chinese. Because to me, that is really a defining feature of the divisions in society that we've seen in recent years. So I wanted to see if that could be captured. And, the findings in a nutshell really are that we all have biases, and our biases, pertain both to gender and to race, and that our biases in respect of race are stronger, right? They're more embedded and entrenched than our biases in respect of gender issues. On the gender spectrum, we're more open-minded in relation to gender and career, and we have many challenges yet to overcome in relation to gender and STEM. And on the other hand, our biases towards South Asians are far more entrenched than our biases towards mainlanders. The study I did also tried to experiment with interventions and tried to test whether an intervention can help to mitigate these biases. Because, as you know, there are studies around the world now that demonstrate that interventions don't work. You can't address unconscious bias by an intervention. So I wanted to test that hypothesis. And what I found was that interventions do work as long as they're tailored and really contextualized to target the particular form of discrimination that you're trying to mitigate. And I found that it was possible to correct people's unconscious biases in relation to gender, but it was much harder. In fact, not really very, I wasn't very successful at being able to mitigate against people's racial biases. Those were the most entrenched. And I think the takeaway from that study for me is that our racial biases are so deeply entrenched because of historical factors, but also our socialization and our constant exposure to the negative views that society kind of peddles around minorities, that we have to work much harder and go beyond sort of a one-off intervention to undo those kinds of unconscious bias. And obviously, I mean, if we think about what is unconscious bias, those are perceptions that we've acquired over a long period of time through our socialization, our cultural, religious, economic, geopolitical exposure and environment, and, repetitive exposure to ideas about particular communities. And if we think about the Hong Kong context, especially what I mentioned about schools, if the majority of ethnic minority kids, for example, are not going to mainstream public schools, but are going to separate schools, and if the majority of us tend to live in Yao Tsin Mong and Yuen Long, and if the majority of us are only in the news for all the wrong reasons, those are prime sort of factors that are influencing people's biases. And so when you're never confronted with a positive example, you know? And so when you first encounter an ethnic minority, your gut reaction, because of the way that we're sort of hardwired in our brain, is to think of people as a threat and to think about how to get rid of them, right? Or to kind of not expend your resources on them. So I really strongly believe that it's very, very important to tackle sort of these biases at a very early stage in life, but also to really review extensively the sources of such negative perceptions, but also to work on a counter narrative. So it's not enough just to teach people to be non-discriminatory. It's not good enough just to say, oh, you should not be biased. It's very important to recognize that social media and other forms of exposure are constantly peddling these negative realities to people. And then there has to be an equally pervasive or strong counter narrative that is telling people that this is not true, or here are some positive examples of people who are contributing. So one example of the work that I'm trying to do is to educate people about the contributions of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong. So some of the examples I shared with you, many people in our community, even in our own community, among the ethnic minority community, have no idea that we've contributed to sort of these landmark institutions that really are a part of the history and making of Hong Kong. And I think that that's really a huge part of the problem. And that really sort of needs to be addressed through kind of work to, first of all, make people understand that we are part of the problem and this is where we are weak. And then to say we all have a responsibility because this is happening, whether we're aware of it or not aware of it, right? And so we have this responsibility and we owe it to kind of future generations to create a space which is more inclusive, receptive, and that can enable every member to be a productive member of the community. And if I'm to talk in business terms or economic terms, which language I think is more appealing to some people because they're very calculative, the long and short of it is it's more economical in the long run if people are independent and productive members of society rather than, drawing on sort of limited resources in relation to social welfare. So why would you set up a community to fail? Why would you not want to undo this entire system that's producing or setting up people to fail? It just makes no business sense.
Yeah, I really love the approach that you're suggesting there. It's like not just raising the negative issues, or because, like, whenever you talk about, oh, hey, there's a problem, you guys are biased. A large amount of people are going to be like, yeah, whatever, fine. But then, like, you're also suggesting a narrative to counter the negative representation that has been persisting in the society, basically telling them, hey, these people have been contributing to the city for the longest times, and you might not even know all these amazing landmarks and contributions are made by ethnic minorities. So I really love how you're putting in a little bit of that positive approach to hopefully influence people's perceptions as well. One other data related question that I have, like you mentioned earlier, right? A lot of Asian or like Asian related data when it comes to like racism or like stereotypes are very US centric. It's because there's a huge population of Asian Americans in the States, and because they are a lot more concentrated in one nation. So it will essentially mean they might have the resources or the lobbying power to sort of like do more researches about their own issues and representation. But there are also Asian diasporas outside the US, outside Asia, for example, British Asians, Asians in Europe, in Africa. They are a lot more spread out. Not a lot of people know about their existence, their experiences, but then they have been around in those parts of the world for the longest time. So I'm wondering if there are even any approaches that could begin to capture the experiences and their representation in data. Would you have any points of view on this?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we started out talking about is how everything that we're witnessing in the context of Hong Kong has demonstrated that it's really a microcosm of what is unfolding at the global level, right? And so for me, that's a really important lesson to draw on and to reflect on. How do we connect the dots if we're seeing that ethnic minorities are underrepresented or overrepresented in a negative way and underrepresented in positions of power globally? Then we should connect the dots and talk about systemic racism and how it's unfolding in different parts of the world. And recognizing the different contexts, we should start to piece together the data and then identify strategies and solutions for engagement so that we can develop solutions to move forward. Because people would not take a problem at face value unless you have the evidence. So that's where the data comes in. People will not be ready to raise awareness about a problem if we don't also propose solutions at the same time. And so we really have to do this work collectively by connecting the different advocacy groups or NGOs that are set up in order to support diaspora communities in different parts of the world. And if there isn't such a group, I think it's very important to set up such groups within each of those nations where there are diaspora communities. And, the reality is that many of these diasporic communities have been set up because of the advent of slavery or colonialism. So there's a very deep-rooted history that we all share, right? And we are called ethnic minorities, but generations ago, we would be called refugees. We're just at a different point on the same spectrum of not belonging. But now we're moving towards the other end of the spectrum. So for me as a third generation Hong Konger, I'm moving to a point in the spectrum where, this is home for me. And so I think that it demonstrates that there is a prospect for progress and inclusion and loyalty to the community that you've grown up with, that you can then harness for positive action and productive action that is better for Hong Kong or whatever nation, you're now part of. And that's the nature of global citizenship, I think, that we're all moving towards or should be moving towards. So it's very important, I think, to think about how you connect movements around the world and understand experiences as being greater than just these individual experiences. And what's been most troubling, I think, for me is when you think in these global terms, you start to recognize common patterns of behavior. And you recognize that the impact is not individual. The consequences are not individual. They're actually cumulative. And that's one of the greatest failings of the law, and why I feel social justice advocacy is so important is because the law can only take you so far. The law can only help you identify individual circumstances of exclusion or discrimination. But I think when you have this cumulative, repeated, systematized unfairness and injustice, you then recognize that the world has been set up in a way to create this massive underclass that has given rise to huge inequalities. And so unconscious bias is just one point. It's just one juncture on this long highway of injustice that really is sort of a pathway that ultimately, if it's not addressed, it has the potential to culminate in dehumanizing hatred, violence, and even death. And none of these are just scary epithets that I'm just throwing out there. These are realities that we've now witnessed over and over again. And for me, I feel this great sense of uh, what are we waiting for? What more do we need to sort of feel moved enough to recognize that this is the greatest tragedy of our time that is unfolding before our eyes? And what else would it take for us to recognize our responsibility to step up and do something about this? And, I hope that that kind of motivation can drive, especially kind of young people to crave better education that really shines a light on these issues, that helps unpack some of the ways in which we're taught to see different people, to understand their circumstances, and to treat different people. I think these narratives that we're exposed to, they come up for us very early on in our education. And maybe that to me represents the strongest, most direct potential pathway to address unconscious biases so that we don't end up having this tragic end at the end of the spectrum of unconscious bias.
Yeah, I do echo what you mentioned about the limited power of law, because sometimes if there is no law established to protect a certain community against discrimination, does that mean discrimination against those communities doesn't exist, right? So I completely agree with what you just said there. But Pooja, another aspect that sort of fuse maybe a bit of that stigma or even discrimination against ethnic minorities in this part of the world in Asia is, like you mentioned earlier in the episode, religion is also a factor. And in fact, religion is a topic itself that's very extremely sensitive in Asia Pacific, but there are really like over 4,000 recognized religions globally. But unlike the US, in Asia, people don't really talk about that openly. Or I have heard comments about how, like, maybe in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in India, in those countries, it's very sensitive, and people also sort of categorized Hong Kong as a city where the talks of religion doesn't really exist, or like people kind of don't see religions. So I find all these observations very, very interesting. But I want you to help us understand just how complicated is the discussion of religions in Asia, and why is it so sensitive?
I think that's such a huge sort of question, and obviously, there's so many factors that one could kind of focus attention on. But let me start with this, right? We are living in a region that's probably one of the most diverse regions globally, right? And historically, Asia has always been characterized by diversity, regardless of the kinds of empires that we've had. So in the pre-colonial period as well, in fact, when one of the sort of emperors of India, for example, Asoka in 4th century BC, or even in the Ottoman Empire, right? There were these periods where a lot of people of very diverse religious backgrounds and orientations were living together. And there were policies instituted that were designed to ensure that there was religious harmony and inclusivity and a recognition that everybody brought something to the table. Whereas now I think we're living in a climate where the majority of the Asian kind of nations are not of the same kind of liberal democratic temperament that you see in for example, in the West. That said, just because the West is liberal democratic has not meant that it has escaped the challenge of managing religious diversity. In fact, we note that the West was the source of this serious tragic episode in our humanity where the Jews were the target of such gross violence and genocide, right? So that's where history sort of connects us in that we have seen an era of grave persecution, and that persecution persists in ways now towards different religious communities. So obviously, with 9/11, we've seen the rise of Islamophobia, and that is not only something that is sort of limited to the West. It's also something that has pervaded sort of the Asian context, especially if you think about the two largest nations or the most heavily populated nations in Asia. So, as much as Asia has the most populated state or nations comprising Muslims, so I'm talking about Malaysia and Indonesia, at the same time, we also have India and China, which do perceive Islam as one of the greatest rising threats in terms of religion. And so I think that, we've got the notion of Islam being a threat to our value system. And I think a lot of that is rhetoricized because of how it's been politicized in the West, but also in this part of the world. And coupling that with kind of the more authoritarian tendencies of the regimes that we have in the region, even with India, despite it being the world's largest democracy, there are some very problematic policies that we're seeing emerging there. And there's a lot of rhetoric and narrative around kind of Muslim populations or Muslim values and Muslim practices that have increasingly come under attack in ways that, haven't been seen before. The other complexity, of course, is even within the religious community itself, there is a huge diversity in terms of religious practice, value systems, the sects, right? The sects within each of these religious communities. And they aren't able to reconcile how to live together or how to sort of view each other. There are, some factions within those groups as well. And so, as with any religion, right, even if you take Christianity, there's a spectrum. You've got the liberal, the moderates, and then you've got the, fundamentalists. And it's the same with the Hindus, and it's exactly the same with, I think, the Muslims, right? So that's one challenge, that you've got these very strong extremes that are playing out in different contexts. And I think that the more there is exclusion or this tendency to suppress, the greater this need to manifest in some kind of a more overt manner for some of these communities, right? In order to not be obliterated, in order to remain visible. So, for example, the post 9/11 policies led to a global reckoning, which saw many Muslims decide to adopt a more visible form of their religious or cultural dress, right? And that was a deliberate decision And we've seen that happen in the context of cultural communities as well, where, for example, diaspora have relocated or located to the West, for example. If there are pushbacks against their traditions, they tend to become even more entrenched because they want to hold on to those facets of their identity, right? And so you see this constant kind of dance between oppression and then the resurgence of religious identity or cultural identity. And so it's really important to see this as an interplay with the kind of political context. And obviously, we're treading very dangerous ground where we're seeing, the potential. I think the only way in which it can be labeled is really the genocide of Muslims in Myanmar, in the Rakhine State, for example, and how that was fueled largely by the deployment of social media as a vehicle to kind of generate the kind of hate that would allow people to feel that that is not a community that is even human, and therefore their deaths are insignificant, even though the deaths have amounted into a significant number. And I think that that's sort of the common pattern that we see. What we had seen historically with the Jews is now becoming a common feature that we're witnessing in relation to Muslim communities, especially in Asia, whether we're talking about India or we're talking about Myanmar, we're talking about China. I think that these are some of the sensitivities that inhibit people from openly professing their religion, from openly engaging in religious discussion, and this talk about tolerance rather than inclusion. I think is problematic because tolerance denotes the sense that you're doing a favor in terms of, bearing somebody. I'm putting up with you. I'm tolerating you. And I think that terminology is, deeply problematic. But that's kind of where I think we are at in the region. And so religion and politics have become deeply intertwined, and there isn't kind of the moral authority left in the institutions of the world, whether we're talking about the UN or we're talking about, leaders of the free world. We would look to the UK traditionally or the US. I don't think that either of those nations now bear the moral authority to be able to tell other countries what to do. And so we're really seeing a trend in a negative direction. And that's why it's so hard to contend with religion in this sphere, because everyone is labeled as a kind of pro this or pro that, or a hardliner X or a hardliner Y. So I think that it's very important to think about how we are educating the general population about sort of religious communities and the realities.
As someone who is agnostic, I always find it quite shocking how much religions could cause hostility and divide. Because sometimes, somehow, my approach to talking about religions with people is that I would always expect disagreements, and that's okay. And also, when you really look at the fundamental values that all these various religions are teaching their people, it's really kind of going back to that simple message of doing good or love each other. But historically, it has really caused a lot of hate, and it has even become a reason that someone would start a war, someone would start killing people. So it is a very complicated topic, but I do want to ask, in terms of policy level, is there any work that can be done to foster a sense of religious acceptance or inclusion, not on like nation level, but maybe within the workplace, within a school? Is there anything that can be done in the Asia context, really?
Absolutely. I think that it's fundamental to introduce children to some of the basic tenets of religion and to highlight some of the commonalities, as you said, right? There are some features that are common across religious teachings and that can really be a force for unity and promoting a shared value system and common understanding, right? In terms of the treatment of the common man and what our responsibilities are towards each other, how we treat our families and our broader communities. So I think that that is fundamental, and that's where I feel that we don't do a great job because many schools either tend to be kind of focused on one religion, or in their religious studies curriculum tend to take a very essentialized view of other religious groups, right? So They might depict kind of these are the traditions if you're Muslim, right? You celebrate Eid, you wear these costumes, and then you apply henna, and this is Diwali, and so it's very surface level. It doesn't engage in a deep enough manner to really foster the sense of understanding. And so I think that there should be a compulsory kind of course that is taught by example. And I think that, we have the resources to bring together, some of the religious leaders or practitioners in the classroom and enable kind of a really open exchange and dialogue. And whenever that has been done, so for example, I, moderated a panel between a Hindu, a Sikh, and, a Muslim cleric. And we talked about the importance of education for girls and what are some of the basic tenets of each of the religions. And it was such a productive conversation. And it actually surprised many people because they realized that they harbored these completely ignorant views about Hinduism or Sikhism or Islam. And that it's just that simple. Sort of a lunchtime session where people just got into the room and talked about these things was effective in unraveling or at least forcing people to question, where did I get this idea from? And why didn't I turn to the source or ask somebody who is a Muslim, who is a Hindu, and say, is this true? Right? Is this, can you tell me some more about this? I want to understand. And that's a problem. We're very pro judgment and we don't do our due diligence. And so it's part sort of exposing people to kind of the tenets through this, instructional format, or maybe have kind of a dialogue, but it's also educating young people how to ask questions, how to obtain information that can help you recognize your blind spots so that you don't jump to any conclusion, right? And that's where unconscious bias work is important because it can set the groundwork for you identifying some of your weak spots and being like, oh, I seem to have this tendency to look at this group unfavorably. So I need to do more work. Now, how do I do that work? Well, here's where you can start. And I think that would go beyond the sort of more typical approaches we see in the community, which is people say, oh, I'm going to go celebrate Diwali with this group. And I'm going to apply henna. I'm going to wear this religious dress. I'll put on a bindi, and then that makes me more culturally sensitive, or but that's not the end game. The end game is to seek an entry point and then obtain a vantage point from which you can really do the work of accepting, which can only come once you understand. And I think that's what this comes down to. The laws or the policies or measures around inclusion or anti-racism are still very surface level. And people are not prepared to invest the time and the resources to do the work. You have to work on yourself. We all have to work on ourselves to do better and to push ourselves to be uncomfortable and recognize that our thinking is not perfect. We're part of the problem. And then at least to say, well, okay, I recognize the problem, which means I can do something now, right? Because you can't fix what you can't see. And this is where the research part comes in, right? So all of this comes together because when you use an intricate and complex research methodology to unravel some of the nuanced ways in which we're oppressing particular communities, and it's structural, it's systemic, we then have the capacity to push ourselves to come up with equally intricate sort of methodologies then to tackle those problems. And when you do this targeted work, you're then more likely to come up with productive solutions that actually have impact. And the goal for me is not just to educate and then leave it at that. The goal for me is, okay, you did this, you've done this work. Now let's measure. Where did you get to, right? So you started out with this unconscious bias. After you implemented these measures, you've done the work. Let's see where you are now. And then to take stock again at another juncture, maybe a year down the road. And so to recognize that this work is ongoing, it's continuous, it's not one-off, and it requires constant effort if we're really serious about tackling systemic issues, because I strongly believe that a systemic issue warrants a systemic response. It can't be dealt with like a one-off piece of legislation or one case or anything like that. It won't do.
Especially we live in a time where people can easily jump to conclusions based on the first online comment that they see within a social media post. So basically, adopting critical thinking and that awareness that we are biased and our thinking is flawed is way more important than ruling out biases that we have, because it's impossible. So I'm really thankful to have a very powerful voice like you to be speaking with our listeners and also bring to light all these issues that are facing ethnic minorities, not just in Hong Kong, but around the globe. But now it's time for us to move on to the next segment, which is called Rapid Bias. And now in this segment, I'll be asking my guests biased questions that they've got asked at some points in life. And these questions are more directed to ethnic minorities in Hong Kong or in Asia. So Puja, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Let's
go.
Let's go. First question. Where are your parents from?
My parents are from India, but they settled in Hong Kong a very long time ago.
And next one. Wow, you don't have an accent.
Wow, you don't have an accent.
That's a really powerful one. And the third question. No, you can't be from Hong Kong.
What does it take to be from Hong Kong? Does it take being born here? Does it take going to school here? Does it take being a productive member of the community? Does it take being able to speak in Cantonese? I can tick a lot of those boxes. In my short lifetime, I can say I've done many of those things. And if that doesn't qualify me as a Hong Konger, then I would say that many of the people who pose this question can't be a Hong Konger either. And I think one of the most prominent legacies is the reality that many of our ancestors who came in with the British Army as part of the battalion, right, the Indian soldiers, or the Nepalese Gurkha community who provided security in the colonial era. You know, they have probably done far more to signify their loyalty to Hong Kong and the people of Hong Kong. And so if those communities who have given their blood, sweat, and sacrificed for Hong Kong can't be seen as Hong Kongers, then I really don't think many communities would qualify to call themselves Hong Kongers.
And the next question is, there is no racism in Hong Kong. Look at you. You're a successful ethnic minority here.
For every opportunity that you have had, I have had 10 doors that rejected me. For every hour that you spent networking, I probably spent 10 times as much to even find one lead so that I could get my foot in a particular door. For every person in your network that you could see as a role model, I spent my entire youth dreaming to be the role model so that the communities that come after me can look up and say, hey, I can be successful too. I could contribute and I don't have to necessarily live a life of poverty. So for as much as Hong Kong has meant the world to me and made me who I am, I would say that it has happened in spite of the racism, because of the efforts and the sheer hard work that I've had to put in every hour of every day to work 10 times or 100 times harder than anybody else who's my contemporary, in order to not only get to the position that I'm at, but also to be able to stay in this position. Because people are always ready to write you off, and people are always ready to take you down. For a person like me, it would just take one mistake for my downfall. And that is a reality that I live with every day. So just imagine living like that, where the sword of Damocles hangs over your head for every action or inaction.
And finally, when do you go back home?
I don't have to go back because I'm always here.
Nice. Thank you so much for playing this round of rapid fires, Puja, with all your powerful responses. And now, to conclude the episode, are there any projects that are in the works for you that you could tell us about?
Well, I think I alluded earlier to the importance of connecting global challenges and actors who are, determined to do something. And so, one such project on the horizon for me is really to pull together a community of advocates, young people, first in Hong Kong and then globally, who can work on developing a cross-cultural curriculum that can speak to the systemic nature of biases and then work on counter narratives of how we tackle them. And I'm hoping to enlist young people because I think that they are equipped with the potential and the capacity to harness the power of sort of technology in a positive way. And I really want to bring all of those resources together to co-create something that hopefully will have this lasting impact and maybe can turn around this very tragic legacy that we have of slavery and colonialism into something very different. And it would be so amazing if the future narrative could be that this was the generation that basically helped generate a new counter narrative that changed the way the world looked at diasporic communities. So that's the vision.
Nice. I can't wait to see this coming to life. And finally, I just have one last question for you, Puja. To you, what does it mean to be proudly Hong Konger?
I think that it is really such an honor to be living in a moment and to have faced the challenges that I've faced so that I could have a deeper understanding of the work that needs to be done and to be able to be in a position to contribute towards positive change so that Hong Kong could be this microcosm of a community that could set an example for the potential that we could all have if we were able to develop an inclusive community that was welcoming and really set a good example of how we can contribute to the long-term productivity of an entire nation. So I think that, being proudly Asian comes from living in an era where it's still possible to achieve something like that, or at least make a start.
Thank you so much for joining us on Proudly Asian, Puja, and thank you so much for the work that you've been doing.
Thank you, Isabel. It's been so wonderful chatting with you.
That's it for this episode of Proudly Asian. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at proudly.asian for more content. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Leave us a 5-star review on wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and signing off for now. I'm Isabel Wong.